Record button. Okay, cool.
Let me see if that's better. Yeah, cool. All righty. So what we're going to start with is just going to go over the studio overview first. What I'm going to do is, so right now what we're looking at is when you log in, it takes you to this site here, which is just bildr.com/studio. This shows you a list of all the projects that you've created, which would be on the left side here. And on the right side, any project that someone has added you as a collaborating project. But what we're going to do is we're just going to click new project. I'm just going to call it office hours for now. One thing to note here, when you do create a project, is the region. This will default to whatever region is closest to the IP address that you're currently at, but you can easily toggle that if you need to host this project in Europe or Asia. That's a lot of times I notice this is kind of overseen and people miss that that's there. But if you do accidentally create a project in a region you didn't want, you can change the region afterward. You can find that under the project settings, which we can take a look at that later. But what we're going to do here is I'm just going to leave it as the blank project, just because I'm going to start one from scratch so we can build a full CRUD app from scratch. But before I create it, there's a few different templates that we have on here. There's an onboarding template, the SaaS starter, which is a popular one, a Chrome extension template. And if you hold a Bildr pass or a studio pass, you do get access to the premium Web3 templates, which right now we have a token gated Airtable, token gated allow list site, the Hustle Cats launch site, and then the 8-bit zombies launch site. So anytime you create one, you can definitely start with any of those. But for today's purpose, we're just going to go with the blank project. I'm going to go ahead and create it. And once that project is created, it's going to load the actual studio here, which is this here. So when it's a blank project, what happens is it automatically opens this menu item at the top called Add Page. And on here, there's not much templates on here. There's the blank page. There's a couple landing pages and some basic home pages that you can start with. I'm not going to do anything yet. We'll come back to this. But what we're looking at here, this is the infinite canvas. Basically, this is where you can drop your pages. You can organize them and place them anywhere on the canvas that you like. To the left, we have the nav. The first menu item is the projects list. So this takes you back to the page we were just looking at. That shows you all the projects. Workspaces and pages. We have data collections and users, your media library, so any assets that you need to upload to your project, any custom fonts that you want to add to the project, style classes, we have themes, the URL page routes, page headers, secrets, the auth settings for this project, action types, element types. These are a little more advanced. In here, as you begin to use any action or element type on this project, it begins to bring in those actions and element types to the local project here. Within both of these is also the ability for you to create any custom action or element types. So very powerful once you understand how the setup works and know how to work those. Then we have deployments, collaborators, project metrics, project settings is the one I was referring to earlier. So if you do accidentally create the project in the wrong region, go into the project settings, there's a change region link here. It gives you a warning just to let you know, make sure you know that you are going to move everything from the project, including all its data and users, to the new region. And then you also have some defaults like the language, project image descriptions, and then some default settings. One thing to note here, by default, when a project is created, the metrics are disabled. You can always come into the project settings to enable that. And that will then begin tracking like your page views, data requests, document requests, API calls. Another method to enable that is by going to the metrics directly. When you do go there, it does give you a little prompt here if it's disabled, and clicking this will clicking this will activate it, and then it gives you a little bit of information of the different areas that we're tracking metrics on. I'm going to close out of that. Okay, so at the top, back to the add page button. So again, this is where you basically begin when you are starting a blank project. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag and drop a blank page, and we're going to rename this to home. What we're going to do next is start building elements or adding elements to our page. And we can do that with a few different options up here. So there's the add elements, which this will basically give you the core elements that are included in every project. So you got things like headers, footers, section containers, different layout methods, typography elements, buttons, inputs, different media elements, data elements like the grid list, very powerful tool, and some default light boxes. You can also use blocks, which are basically, think of these like elements, but they're like already elements that are put together with children elements inside of them. So like a header that's already pre-built. So it's going to contain a header element, probably an image at the top left, some menu items on the top right, a button, an action button. But all these components are different. You can just bring those in. And once you bring them in, you can alter them or change them to however you need to change it to, or update the styling to match your site. We also have patterns. These are the curated patterns that are available for everyone. So you can bring in like some Google chart patterns, the Screenly, screenshot any URL pattern. There's the data manipulation patterns, a job board, the user auth. This one's also very popular. The connect with MetaMask patterns, and etc. One thing to note about patterns also is that any project can become a pattern. Basically, once you have your project built out, what you do is you actually go back to the workspaces and patterns. And when you mouse over the specific workspace, you do have this link here called share a pattern. When you do walk through that process of sharing a pattern, all those patterns are private. At the end of the process, it gives you a unique pattern, GUID, and you can capture that and share that with anybody. And the way someone else would bring in that pattern that you created is by going into patterns. You would click on have a pattern code, paste in that code, hit enter, and that's going to find that pattern. And then you'll see an import button to bring that in. That's very helpful sometimes, like when you're helping somebody else create something or something similar that you already created, and you want to share that with them so they don't have to start from scratch. So just a quick way to share, anything on that workspace. So it'll bring in pages, elements, actions, style classes, basically everything, even documents if there's documents on that pattern. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to build out this home page. I'm just going to drop a container here. We're going to add a header. And I'm just basically laying out the page that we're going to create here. We'll throw a section next. And what we can do is probably just use one of these predefined footers just to fill in some content. And actually, we'll do the same thing for the header, so we don't have to create that, just so it looks a little nicer. And I think this is the one. And we're going to delete that one. I'm just going to change some of the styling here just so we have some info here, just a minimum height so we can see the content. And I'm just going to call this items. We're just going to build an items list. We're going to add a button.
So you'll notice as Dorian is building this out, all of the elements are going to show up in a panel on the left side when you have a page selected. And then on the right side, when you have an element selected, you'll see all the things that you can edit for that element. So the styling class, I think it's the styling tab, the data tab, the events tab, where you'll set up flows and actions, which Dorian will probably show us.
Yeah,
And,
so what I'm doing here is creating the data collection because we're building a CRUD app. And I'm just going to create an items list. So what I did is I went to data collections, created a new one, named it items. Now I'm just adding my fields. So we're going to have a name. We can have an image, maybe just a simple description. And now that we have that, I created a flow on the create item button. That's basically just creating a record. And that's creating the record. I'm selecting the collection. We're going to populate the name, which we'll come back and fill that in a second because I need to actually create some inputs. Image, we don't need a default. We'll just put a default description here. Or sorry, we'll go to static, just text. All right. So we're just gonna grab an input. We'll drop that on here. And we're just gonna add some styling just so it looks a little bit better. Okay, and we'll just call this name. We'll go back to our action here. That's going to come from our name. We're now going to drop a grid element, which we'll just put it in here for now. And the data, we're going to populate it from the items list. We're going to get all the fields. I'm going to sort it by the name. Now we're going to create the grid row. So I'm just going to, I went to blocks. Just so I don't have to build that format, I'm just going to use that block. We'll drop it here onto the canvas. That creates our page. We're going to bind our info here. We'll make this our delete. For the delete, because it's in a grid row, it will already know the context for the data that's being set into the grid. So all we really have to do is basically select the collection of this row that we're trying to delete. It basically just grabs the ID from the variable on that row. If you're wanting to target a specific row that's not the grid row that is being displayed here, then you actually wouldn't even use this delete permanent action. Instead, what you would do is use the update record. And using the update record, it will allow you to specify the ID and where to get the ID. That way you can target that specific row. Because I know some users in Discord had asked where they're populating a grid, but the data being sent into the grid is not actually the record that they're trying to delete. And they try to use this delete permanent action and it doesn't work because it probably doesn't find that ID for that collection. So just something to think about whenever you're setting those up. And a couple of things I'm doing to this text box is I'm making it editable just so I don't have to create like a separate edit form. I'm just going to edit the information in line. So first thing I did was on the events on Blur, I set the autosave. For the autosave to work, you do have to have the data record value bound to the collection and the field. And actually here, I picked the wrong one. So let's fix that because that's the name. And we're just gonna add some styling here just so it looks a little bit better.
So several different tabs when you're styling something at the bottom. You've got the all properties view, which will show you all of the properties. They're just little GUI forms where you can look, margin, padding, etc. And then use properties will show you only the things that are currently styled on that element. And then you have the CSS tab if you want to write the CSS directly.
Yeah, exactly. And again, here I'm just styling just to clean it up a little bit. Okay, so what I did next was I deleted the default image element because what I want to do is I actually want to give the ability to upload a document per row. And what I did is I went to elements, I just searched for image, and instead of using the image, which is just a display, I changed it for the image uploader. And just like any field or text element where you're binding data, the image uploader works the same way. So on the event, there's a default change event already with it. I just selected the autosave. For the data, I just bound it directly to that collection and the field where I'm storing the path for that image that gets uploaded. So let me know if you guys have any questions on any of that. So we're going to go back to the grid list. So now that we have our list row, we're going to tell it what page to display. The data we had already bounded, so that's all ready to go. The one thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a data listener. And this is so that anytime we add or delete a row from this data collection, it's going to listen for that so that it can update our grid display without us having to trigger a manual refresh.
So quick note on that, because you're moving it a little fast, Ryan, is I'm just going to say every page, when you've got one selected, you'll see a page body at the top, and that will take you to the page properties. And that's where you can set up unique things for that at the page level. You can even do styling at the page level. That's where you'll find the data listeners. And then I think you can set up some other things there too. Change the page name, all that stuff. You can also do that on the canvas.
Yeah, and I can go back here. So if we're looking at the settings of the page, there's a few methods to get to it. So when you have a page selected or any element that's a child to the page, it automatically opens the navigator in the left panel here. And at the top, it's going to label the page name. And there's the little 3 dots here. And you can go to page properties. So notice that opens the right panel, loads the page properties. I actually never use that method. What I do is, because this is already open on the left, if you just click on the page body, that automatically takes you to the page properties, which is a lot quicker. But things you can do here, it's like Cora was saying, you can change the name, the title. This will only work if this page is a root page. So if it's a landing page, if it's a child page, that won't have any effect on the browser title. You can also change it, move the page to a different workspace. Right now we only have the one, so there's nothing to move it to. But sometimes if your projects get large and you're trying to reorganize all the pages, this is a quick way to move this specific page to a different workspace. The next area here is flows. By default, anytime you create a new page, or even if you duplicate a page, it automatically sets the page load flow as the page that runs, which what we call is on form start. So when the form renders, when it loads, this is the first action that will automatically be called. You can always come in here and change it to any flow of your choosing, but by default, most of the time you probably would just leave that. And if you're wanting to change or have a different flow run on page load, a better method would be to just go into that page load flow and just nest your flow that you're wanting to run, or you can just directly add actions directly to that page load. Let me go back. So that's what the page flow does. The autosave, this one's not really used here. We don't default it this way anymore. I think eventually we'll get rid of this option, but this basically allows you to define the default autosave action that you want to use anytime the autosave flow executes. It just gives you the ability to override. Haven't really seen this get used much in users projects. We use it in the Bildr project. But that's because we do specific unique things there. So it's a little bit different. So we needed a way to manually set the default to a different method. And that's what that allows you to do. The next thing is the root page flows. So the first one is if you want to run a flow when the connection is lost. So like on your landing page, if you have a flow defined in any of these here, it'll actually add a listener to the page and it's just checking to see if it's connected. If it loses connection, then it will trigger the flow that you select here. When the connection gets reestablished, then it will trigger this flow here. And then there's also a flow if the authentication is lost, meaning sometimes you have an end user that authenticated into your app. And let's say that session had an expiration time or that user manually cleared their cookies or whatever reason that causes the auth session to expire or no longer be there, then that will trigger this flow to run. So things you can do is pop up like a light box that says, hey, you need to re-sign in, or automatically redirect the user to the home page. Just allows you to do something like that. This next one is anytime the revision changes. This was one that came up, I think, a couple office hours ago. The ability to like notify the user anytime you do a publish. This will actually do that because this puts a listener where it's checking to see if the revision changed. Anytime you create a publish, a new revision ID is created and gets pushed out. So you could put like a banner in the UI for the user to let them know it's like, hey, we just did an update, refresh, or you can just have a button on that banner that will automatically do it or allow them to click it. The next one is authentication.
Hey, Dorian, sorry. We have some questions.
Yep.
They're asking about the autosave flow special thing you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
They're asking if you can talk a little bit more about that, how you use it.
Yeah, so basically this defines the default action that gets used when an element is dropped on the page, and it binds it as the auto save flow. I believe it's on the on change event. Let me see if we can try it here. So like, let me drop in the element. Let's make sure it still works, right? We'll just say it's an email. So when I drop this element, notice no action is being set. And I believe it's the on change where it's going to get set, but we'll find out in a second. So what we'll do here is we'll trash that. We'll go back here and I'm going to define that for that autosave. I want to use the action in here that's also called autosave, which is this one here. So let's try it now. So now if we drop this element, it should default to that action now, which it didn't. Let's see if it put it in the JSON. Maybe it just doesn't display it. No, it actually didn't. So we'll have to look at that, but it's like I was saying, it's probably an action that we really don't use anymore, and it probably broke at some point. But what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to automatically assign and bind that action anytime you drop an element that has an on change event. But looks like it's not actually working at the moment.
Sorry, Dorian, what was that? What action is not working? I can write that up.
Yeah, so it's on the page body, or not the page body, on the page properties.
Mm-hmm.
Under the flows category, we have a select where you can define the default autosave action to use.
Gotcha.
And I believe what that's supposed to do is automatically bind the on change or probably on blur if it's a text element to that flow, but it looks like it's not using that at all. So we'll have to go look to see what's happening there. Yeah, we implemented that a long time ago. Because like when we were building out Bildr, we were like adding all these fields, and like most of the time we just needed it to bind that action to save it. So we didn't have to manually go to every, input and set that event. So we added that feature to do that, but looks like it broke at some point. Okay, so let me see. The last thing I want to go over on the page properties is the authentication. This is important. So like if this page is, let's say like your app's dashboard page, and your application requires a user to sign in, you basically want to toggle that on, because it won't load the page if there isn't an active auth session for a user in your end users list here for this project. And based on the route that you have defined, it will automatically redirect to the non-authenticated page. And I can show you that in a second. So like, I'm just going to click preview. And because this is a blank or a new project, there's no route set yet. We're going to set it to the home page. And I'm going to go back here. I just wanted to do that just to create the route for me. But if we look at the route it created, so this is our home page, which is just the root, so it's the slash, just the main domain. And when we go into those settings, notice there's two selects here, one for the on authenticated page, and then one for when it's authenticated. So if this was a page that required auth, you could set your landing page to be the non authenticated page, and then the dashboard page would be your auth page, and Bildr will automatically just check for the auth session. If it's valid, it'll go to the auth page. If it's invalid, then it will just redirect to the non-authenticated page. And then there's a few other settings you can do here. You can set like the default browser's language setting. You can get the client IP address. If this is toggled on, it basically puts this into a variable on the root page that you can use. You can also define dynamic page data, which I won't go into that one. It's a little more advanced. Custom claims is a new feature we just rolled out. It's a little bit more advanced. We won't go over that today. Okay, so let me go back. So this is the page we just created. And by default, you can't even see the grid list here because we haven't created any records. So I'm just gonna say test, hit create, and notice that now created our record. It populated our grid list here. I'm just gonna give it different names. There's our second record and etc. So basically now we're creating data. If we go back to the studio and go to our data collections, go to items, we can see our 3 records here. And the way I set it up is I'm grabbing the name value from that input. So it's anything I typed in. The image, I wasn't populating anything. The description, I don't know if you remember on the create record action, I had set it to just set this static text of DESC ... just so I can populate something into there. On these rows, I set these to automatically allow me to edit the inputs here, which actually these are just text areas or text boxes. That way I can just change that information. And if you notice, once I change that name, because there is a data listener on here and I have this grid list set to sort by name, it automatically moved that down to the bottom here. And if that's something you don't want to do, then that's probably a scenario where you don't want to actually use a data listener, and instead you can just build your own refresh actions to use whenever you want to trigger them. That way it doesn't confuse the user because you're typing and then it jumped the row as soon as I clicked out. We have the image uploader. Just use this. And if we go back to our data, we can begin to see that information to get populated. So here's the reference to the image. This one got updated to testing. What we'll try now is we'll just try the delete here. So we're going to delete the one that says testing. So notice it's gone there. I'm just going to go back to the data just to confirm, and it did delete it. So that was a basic app, just creating, we're modifying, we're deleting, and it's all being displayed in a grid. I don't know if anyone has more questions or anything specific you want me to cover or go over.
Yeah, okay. So George, would you like to go over any subject? I think Dorian moved through it fast because I gave him a very short time frame to cover a lot. So let's actually kind of get through it. So I think Dorian, George is, I believe, like totally new to Bildr.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe we should go, he might want us to go more in detail on something in specific, like talking about data or something. Because I think we kind of did building and mixing it in with a studio overview at the same time.
Yeah.
So George, come on up and let us know if there's a particular concept or something in the studio that you'd like us to now kind of go a little slower and talk about.
Yeah, so I built the SAS starter, right?
Yeah.
And I just wanted to add a single table to it. I was able to get it working if I started from scratch and actually did it a second time and was more careful about how I copied and pasted things. But I think I'm not really getting some of the patterns, and I could not for the life of me I created a table, right? And I created a row, and I did everything according to the way it, was in the tutorials. I actually went through all the help and all that stuff. And it just wouldn't show up. I could not get the data that was in the table to show up in the rows in the data rows. So I don't know why. I don't know if it was a bug, and I was able to do it when I did it a second time, and as far as I can tell, nothing changed. So I don't know if it's a bug. The problem is I don't have enough experience with the tool to know whether I found a bug or whether I'm just not doing something stupid. I'm just doing something wrong.
There's nothing stupid when you have something that's this complicated. Well, George,
and I have a lot of experience. I'm a React developer, and many years, you can tell I've been around the block. So you don't have I think the one thing I had, so the data listeners, can you give me an idea, just an overview of when you would use a data listener and when you would not use a data listener? Can you give me that sort of an overview of what a data listener is for and what I would expect to see if I had a data listener? Where would I put it? If I put it, do I put it on, at what level do I put the data listeners? I mean, they go on pages, but do I put it at the top level page, the app page, for example, in the SAS, or do I just put it down on the list page? Where would I put that, and what does it do? Let's start with that.
Yeah, so data listeners. So it depends on, where you're trying to automatically populate either data, and it actually doesn't even have to be data. It can be actions that run, but they do get triggered around data changing. So right now, what we're looking at here, this is the home page. So this is like the root page of this test project that we just created.
Okay.
And I'm in the page properties data listeners. And what I did here, so again, this is at the most top level, is I added a listener and I told it what action to run, which actually we need to rename this to flow because they're now flows. And I selected the page binding because that's the scenario that I was trying to do on this setup. But you can actually select any flow that you've created on that page.
So page binding is a flow.
It's just a flow.
If you go over on the left and you look at the flow, you click on flows, there should be a page binding, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So that's defined there. That little Wi-Fi looking thing says what? Says that this
is just this flow is used in a listener.
Okay, it's used in a listener. Okay. And then
Do you know what page binding is used for, George?
Well, if you could explain it to me, I'm
Okay.
pretty sure it listens for changes to the data and then updates the
Yes.
table, right?
Yeah. So page binding, well, it doesn't listen, but what it does is it runs any data binding. So you have to specifically, so it's on every page, you have some default flows that are automatically on it. You've got page load, which automatically runs when a page is loaded. You've got page binding, which is nested in page load. That means anytime a page is loaded, it's automatically going to go run any of the data binding, right? And then you've got auto save, which will automatically save any change. But you have to kind of specify for auto save where you're going to be triggering that to occur, which you might do like on a field change, right? If data's changed in a field, you might want it to auto save, or you might not want to. So you would put that on the on change event if you wanted to do that.
On what on change event? On change event for a given element?
Yeah. So for example, Dorian, click into that field you've got on that page. Okay. So when you've got an element selected on the left, on the right side, you'll see some different tabs. If you go into the events tab, there's different kinds of events that can happen when an end user interacts with an element. Okay. There are some defaults that you'll see in here, depending on the type of element. You'll see something different for a button element than you would for like an input here. For this input element, you'll see an event called change. That means anytime a change is made to that element, you can set a specific flow to run. If you want it to automatically save any change that's made, then you would select the auto save element. I'm sorry, the auto save flow to run. Now, where page binding comes into play is in data listeners. He set that up because even though the page binding runs as part of the page load when it loads, if you have data on that page that's later changed, you may want that data to, those changes to display in real time to your end user. That's where data listeners come in. So then what you would do, or what Dorian did here, is he created a data listener on the page, and it's listening for changes to the data. You have two options that you select in the limiter field, either on add or remove, that's meaning new records added to the data collection or removed. Or you can set it to be only on certain fields, meaning, you know, if you've got a ton of fields on a form, you may not want all of those to be automatically constantly listening for data and updating, right? It may be just a few things that you want. So then you can select set up data listeners for individual fields as well. So what this does is it's actually incredibly powerful, because you can listen for changes to data and set any action, any flow to run. Okay, it doesn't have to be for updating stuff in real time. You can, you can probably do all kinds of crazy things with this if you have flows that you want to run for other things when data gets changed. But what we have here is the page binding. That's what is set to run for the items data collection when an item is added or removed. So now, so basically,
and then you have some flows in there that actually do the page binding, that actually invoke the, so that's anybody here know React JS? Is this Fraser? Is this anything like a use, anything like a hook? Okay, it seems like it's almost like either a GraphQL kind of subscription pub sub, or if it's a React hook use effect.
Yeah, it's similar. It's just
John has a comment in the sorry, go ahead, Dorian. But I think John is also familiar with React and shared something in there. What were you going to say, Dorian?
Okay.
I was saying similar, where it's basically listen.
So it's like a use state, like a use. Okay. Yeah. Use. Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And like Cora mentioned, you don't have to use listeners ever. And you don't have to always select the page binding flow to be triggered when something changes in the data. Because maybe like in my scenario, because this grid list is sorted by the name,
Mhm.
and when I change the name, because I have a data listener set on this page and I have this grid set to sort by the name, as soon as I clicked away from that text area,
Mhm.
it automatically triggered the autosave, which changed the value in the database, which then triggered resonance, the data listener, to run the page binding, which then reorganized my list. And as a UI side of it, that's not very friendly because now, you lost the place for the row you were editing. So in that case, you actually wouldn't even want to use the data listener to run the page binding. Instead, what you could do is maybe create a new flow that just shows a message at the top that says, hey, there's an update to the data list. Do you want to refresh it? And then on click of that button, the user can then click the button that will then trigger the page binding. So it's really up to you to decide what flow you actually want to trigger when there's a change, when that data listener gets triggered.
So if I had this, I mean, this is all in sort of one big page,
Yeah.
right, with a
Yeah.
bunch of grids in it. So if I had like in the SAS demo, right, if I had sub pages that are being paged in and out with the customers and the tasks and all those things, would the listener, where would you put a page listener if you wanted to upload those? Or would you put them at the top level of the container or would you put it on the sub pages that are being brought in?
It probably will be all of them. And it just depends. You basically would put the listener on the page where you want some set of data or whatever flow you're wanting to run when that data changes. So in my case, because I want this grid to populate when new things are added or removed automatically, I put the listener on this page. But I set the limiter to only listen for when records are added and removed.
So, okay, so it's listening for the items collection from when something is added or removed.
Yeah.
And then the auto post, what is that called? The
autosaver.
Autosaver, where does that go?
The autosave actually happens in the row.
Okay, so the row has the event autosave that's on blur. So when you leave the record, you leave the field, it invokes this autosave.
Yeah.
And the autosave, can we look at the autosave? Does autosave doesn't have any parameters, right?
No,
So
no
autosave is
parameters.
just basically take the values that are in this thing and then associate them with the record value.
Yeah.
So, but it's not. So when it's saving at this point, right, the autosave, where is it updating the collection?
It is. So for the autosave to even work or do anything, it requires the data tab to be defined.
Okay.
So in my case, I'm just updating a single field.
Okay.
And under the data definition record value tab, I'm selecting. So it's just a field from my items collection. And the field name is the name. Okay. And that's how Bildr knows which collection and which field. It already knows which record, because when the data, if I go back to the main grid list, so notice this one, I'm not using a record value because it's not just one field, it's a whole collection. When this data gets set, it basically, so it gets set as a JSON, and every object in that JSON is a row, is a record. And when it sets that information, it sets all the fields and values as variables within each row for that specific object, that record.
So that list row has, when it's rendered within the grid list, it has a JSON object attached to it as a local variable that's attached to that row. And then that's what you're accessing when you're accessing the data.
Yeah, like for example, we can see it here. I'm just gonna store that And let me see, make this larger so we can see it. So this is, I'm just basically storing this grid element as a local variable and getting the value out of it just so you can see the data. So we have two records, right? So every record is an object in that array.
Okay.
And this is what each object looks like. So this is the ID of the field where I'm storing the image. And it also has additional like created by, created date. Created by is empty because I'm not logged in as anything. It's just
No, this is it. This is completely filled out because you selected all fields, right?
correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So
But
if I
you pick
restricted
specific, this objects would be more limited. It would only have what you
exactly.
told
So
it.
like if I set it to name only and refresh, if you notice the image no longer
Mhm.
loaded, my descriptions didn't populate. The name should have populated that. Let's see. Let me just see what's happening because the name should have populated for me. I just want to see what's in here.
Dorian, I think there might actually be a bug if you initially select get all fields and you change it where you have to like completely unbind it and then redo it.
It did set it correctly
Okay.
because I can see the field, the values are there. I wonder
Now,
if
what
this
is the?
similar.
This is a kind of a digression from that, but what is the use names versus? Does it give you
It
the names in
changes-
that?
Correct. So if I
okay.
toggle that to on, instead of setting the IDs,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to set the names in the JSON.
Okay. And what is the benefit or drawback to doing it with names
Notice this
versus
name.
IDs?
For the grid list, it actually doesn't really matter. If
Okay.
you're using the table view element, that was what that was implemented for, because every column header, instead of seeing IDs, they'll display the actual name.
Okay.
So it's really just for those purposes, for purposes where the element you're setting the data into is going to use those field
But
values
you
as
need the
display
name, okay,
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
displayed independent.
Exactly. But
yeah,
for the
okay.
grid list, you most likely never use that because you can control all that on the grid row.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll have to come back and debug why that field. It might be what Cora's saying, or
Yeah,
I'm thinking
Dorian,
it
can you try
could
to
be.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that's what my problem was, because I think I was doing everything right. And so far, you haven't said anything like, oh, I wasn't doing that right. But if that's a bug, then I was fiddling around with that because I didn't know what it did.
Dorian, can you go back?
Yeah.
And then click in the data collection.
Like this?
No, in the at the top, yeah, and then do select a data table. Select a data table, like to clear it out totally.
Gotcha.
Gotcha. And then now redo it. And then let's see.
Yeah, it's not even right.
Yeah, this was the kind of stuff I was seeing where I would actually try to, this was kind of the approach I went through. So maybe I hit a bug.
I think you might have, yeah.
Yeah, it's not when you go out. Yeah, I'll have to go look at that. So
Yeah,
it's
this seems a little
definitely
bit,
not
yeah.
resetting that. Let me
Okay,
see.
let's see. Is there a workaround, Dorian?
Yeah, because it's
I guess
still
you
not
could just
setting.
delete that element and re-add it. But I want George to be able to get unstuck on that project that he's working on in case we did find a bug. You can go back and kind of,
Yeah, just leaving that pop.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm
so
not sure. I'll have to look at it.
reset.
And maybe George, you can share that link, the preview link with me, maybe through Discord. And because I'll like to take a look at that and debug it to see where it's failing.
Okay.
Because then we can get that taken care of.
And George,
Because it
that'll
might
be
be
the link at the
similar
top.
to, oops, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, can you just the link at the top anytime you need us to troubleshoot something like on execution in your preview, just grab that link at the top and then you can chat that to us. And that's your preview link and we can kind of help debug with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I bet it's probably similar to that issue, John, that we're gonna look at, where sometimes it's working and not. But yeah, like Junik said, using actions gives you full control. I always use actions.
Let's talk about that, because I think that was also like some part of the confusion that George had is in the
Yeah,
SAS.
I wasn't even paying attention at that point. I'd totally lost it. So can we go through actions and?
Yeah. So in cases where instead of using the built-in data binding, I know the SAS starter uses some of that because there's actually toggles at the top that allow you to filter what data is being displayed.
Right.
So you can't really use that with the data binding because you need to put a condition to determine which filtered set of data you need to set into the grid. So the only approach to that is using just a set value action instead. So the way that would work is, so right now on page load, it's just running the page binding, which the page binding is looking for anything that's defined in the data for any of the elements on the page to set the data. But let's say we wanted to use an action instead. So what I'll do is I'm going to remove the binding from this grid list. And I'm just going to refresh over here so we can see. So notice nothing's being set anymore because there's no data defined. And instead, what we can do is I'm just going to go into the page binding just because it's already inside of the page load. And because I already have that defined in my data listener, that way it just runs the flow. We can just do an element set value action instead. We're going to select the element that we're trying to target, which in this case is our grid list. And for the value, we're going to get it from a data collection. But you can get it from anywhere. So this action gives you a lot of flexibility because sometimes maybe you're doing an API call first, and then you're setting the response from that API call in a variable and you need to grab it from the variable. So that's what you can use this action for, because you can say, you know, I'm going to grab the value for this set value from that variable instead.
Has anybody ever done API calls into Atlas, MongoDB Atlas?
I have not. I don't know if anybody else on the call.
Because we have some data pre-existing stuff, and it would be nice to be able to grab that without having to bring it over into this.
Yeah, you should be able to do any API call from Bildr.
Well, Atlas is a little bit tough. You have to pretty much, it has its own weirdness. It's not like Firebase or something like that.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, if you get stuck, just chat us in Discord. I'm sure any of us here can help you get through that one. But what we're going to do here is change the type to data collection, because that's where I'm going to get the data from. We're going to select items. And again, you get the same settings there. We can say get all fields. You can set your sort and etc. So this part's basically the same setup that we manually did in the data binding tab.
Now, if I had, for example, if I had a Mongo document that had subarrays in it, like that had sub elements in it, could I access those directly through this?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, that would be an API call, and the response of that, you would set it into a local variable, either on the current page, the root, or a parent page. For that setup, you would then go from variable and then target wherever you're setting it, whether it's on the current parent, root, or a specific page. Type the variable name of the variable that you're setting that data into. I'm just calling it API response. And basically what you want to use is down here what's called add a path. And this uses dot notation to step into a JSON, whether it's an array, an object. So like if it starts as an array, you could go like 0 dot and then the next property name.
Okay, like address, or something like that.
Address, and then if that's another array, you can go into the specific one, like 0 if it's the first one, or 1 if the second one, and then dot if it's another. So it's just dot notation, and it'll step all the way through to get to the to the object or array that you're trying to get to. Just keep in mind that if you are setting that into a grid element or a table element, it is expecting an array. So if it's an object, what you can do at the end is just put
Okay.
this path dot as array, and that
So it gives
will
you a one
automatically
element array.
wrap
Yeah.
that object into an array.
Okay.
So you just need to make sure to handle the data and pop or manipulate it in the way it needs to be.
Okay.
Okay.
So good.
George, I'll give you one more question because we're about to, our hour is closing, but I want to make sure that you at least get some that you can go explore some more. So what's next?
Let's see the page. No, I think that'll do for now. I think that's helpful because I really, oh, well, I did want something, but it's going to take too long. I wanted to ask about how to handle those kinds of nested objects. So let's say I had a tree that was dimensions and subdimensions, where the dimension has a reference back to the, or the subdimension has a reference back to the dimension, sort of relational type stuff. I guess I need to go into that before I have real questions, but what is the database that's used behind the scenes, the actual data?
It's just Azure table storage for
Okay.
the data and blob storage for documents.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just like a key value or a regular old
Yeah, it's just a
Redis
flat.
style flat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Super. And George, we do this every week.
Yep.
So,
I've seen quite a few of them actually.
yeah, so every week. So definitely. And then we're available in Discord as well for any specific questions. And then we can also make little videos on the fly. So if there's, how does this thing work? We can definitely.
I've been going down the rabbit holes on no code, low code tools for the past
Yeah.
probably month and a half.
Mhm.
Because I run an agency and we're trying to get to, where we can do things faster. And so far Bildr is my favorite one for web apps. You don't really do mobile native apps yet, if you are ever going to do those, but I got AppGyver and stuff like that for that kind of stuff. But for this, I really enjoy it. And how long have you guys been around?
Oh, that's a while. I don't know, probably over 15 or 16 years.
Wow.
So we started ourselves as an agency, and we've been working together for a long time. I think I've been there for 10 years, Dorian a little bit longer. So essentially we started off as an agency and we built a platform so that we could rapidly iterate. And then, a few years ago, we were like, man, we've had a lot of success with this. Imagine if other people were able to do the same thing. And so we kind of pivoted to creating Bildr as a product. And so we essentially rebuilt this and then tried to infuse it with all of the lessons that we had learned from the magnificent failures that we've had, as you do when you're learning and, running a business and things like that. So we thought like, okay, what are all the lessons that we've learned? Let's put it in here and let's put in all the things that we wish we would have had when we were building for others. And so right now, this is what you'll see in Bildr is probably like maybe version 4 or 5 now. But it's incredibly complex. And I think you've also pointed out the fact that our documentation, we have a long way to go there. We have a long way to go in creating things that are structured, and we're trying to get that off the ground and find people who can help us. Right now, we've got a bounty program where we're kind of tapping into the community to help create some of that content and tutorials and templates. And so I'm really excited about how that's going to go. But yeah, and that's kind of why we do this every week, is we understand it's got a high learning curve. So let's get on here. And this is probably the best way for people to show up and learn, is to be able to ask questions and kind of explain things, since it is so much.
Right. But it's close to the metal, which I like. I mean, you use CSS and JSON throughout the whole thing. And I'm sure you can put JavaScript in there if you need to. And, it's not React, but seems to be just as effective and not as complicated. React is a learning curve too, by the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I've, as I said, I've looked at Bildr, and I've also looked at, there's bubble.io, which I think is the biggest sort of competitor that I've seen.
Mhm.
And there's some other things that are popping up, and they're better advertised than you are, because I think they have big money behind them.
Yeah.
So you're unfortunately competing in a pretty rich market, but it's also a lot of opportunities here for people like me who, I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty.
Mhm.
I don't want too much hand holding, but I do need some level of hand holding.
Oh yeah, in the beginning, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing. I mean, it's a good looking product. I'm hoping that I can use this for, I have 3 or 4 different projects. The first project I'm working on right now is for a company out of Canada, and I'm trying to migrate the React app over to it, the MERN-Stack app. And it's it's slow, but I made some good progress this morning, so I may do the genius dance yet.
Well, hey, any kind of learning that you do is something to celebrate. So definitely chat us if there's somewhere you get stuck, and we'll try and address it. And then if not, we'll see you in the next office hours.
All right.
Thank you
all.
for making
Appreciate
it.
it. Thank you, Dorian.
Yeah, no
All
problem.
right.
Great job.
I just wanted to quickly mention, I did solve it where it wasn't loading the name. It's actually not a bug, it's intentional. What I was missing was you have to tell it to also bring the ID, because the row is using the ID context to go find the record for that entity.
Okay.
Notice as soon as I added the ID and name and refreshed it, now I got the name.
Oh, so you have
that's
to
all
do
it was. So
the
it's not a
ID.
bug. I wasn't thinking about it. And you have to do the same thing in the data binding if you do it like that. So
Yeah,
the
it's
key
sort of a
was the
bug
ID.
though, because it could
Just get all
probably
fields.
be better about reporting that as an error, or not
Yeah.
letting you do that.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, no, good. Okay, that's good to know.
Thanks for clarifying, Dorian.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, wonderful. Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend. We'll see you in Discord and next week.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone. Thank
See
you.